Hello, everybody. My name is Lorelle Sherman. I am currently a forest ecologist postgraduate fellow working with the U.S. Forest Service. I left the Oregon State University insignia on this page because this work was done while I was a master's student at Oregon State University. Dr. Joan Hagar with USGS, who you just heard from a bit ago, she was my master's advisor at Oregon State University, and we worked on this together. So a lot of the information that she spoke about, I will be building off of. Joan talked a lot about the fundamental habitat requirements of the western purple martin and talked about the surveys that we did as part of this work. So I will be kind of cruising by that foundational information and getting into a bit more detail. So if we look at this range map of the purple martin in North America, we see that the eastern subspecies is widespread and abundant, while the southwestern subspecies and the western subspecies are much more limited in their range. This is in part because the eastern subspecies nests virtually completely in artificial housing put up by humans, so their range can actually expand by people just throwing up these gourd racks or nest boxes in their backyards. The western subspecies that we have in western Oregon, where I am, and western Washington, a little bit into northern California and southwestern British Columbia, some of these birds still nest in natural snags in the wild. This is how they nested before humans started putting up artificial housing units. So as a reminder, snags are just standing dead trees, and they're nesting in cavities that have been excavated by things like woodpeckers or just created from natural decay processes in the tree. I'm presenting on just a small piece of my master's research. This portion was looking at habitat. So our long-term goal was to inform what habitat quality means for purple martins, but that's kind of a loaded question. It has a lot of other stuff to do with it, prey availability, all kinds of stuff. So I can't fully answer what is habitat quality, but I can provide the foundational information to start to get at that question. So our objectives were to map the distribution of the western purple martin. Joan talked about the surveys that we did. So we found them to be widespread throughout western Oregon, but very localized. We expected them to be more prevalent on public lands, but we actually found them to be more prevalent on private timber in clear cuts where snags were left. The next thing that we looked at were to determine the habitat associations. So what types of habitat features are in these occupied nesting sites? So this is a lot of graphs, but we're going to just take away a few key points. So in the upper right corner, we were looking at, is there a difference between snags that were used by purple martins as nest sites and not used by purple martins as nest sites in their level of decay or their decay class? And we found that purple martins were using more heavily decayed snags than snags that were not occupied by purple martins. So they're going after more decayed snags, possibly because that facilitates the right type of cavity structure for them. If we look at this bottom left corner here, it is how much of the landscape surrounding the nest snag is qualified as early seral habitat. I think Joan mentioned early seral habitat. It is post-disturbance habitat. So think after a fire or after a clear cut, that really young, kind of almost an absent forest, the precursor to a forest. And what we see here is purple martins were nesting in snags that had a lot of early seral forest surrounding their nest snags. So they like big open spaces. This makes sense because we all know how purple martins fly around. They require these big open spaces to jump off of their nest cavity and get into those soaring flights. There are some other connotations here with insect habitat as well. And then down in this bottom right corner, we see the distance to mature forest. Snags that purple martins were nesting in were farther away from mature forest than snags that they were not using, which goes hand in hand with what we talked about in the last graph. Thing that was surprising to us is that there was no evidence from my data that there's a difference in snag diameter between snags that were used by purple martins as nest sites and snags that were not used. So that means they're using teeny little small diameter snags and also really big diameter snags. And I think Joan alluded to that with some pictures of some of those really puny snags that they were nesting in. We believe that this suggests that there is a limitation of suitable nest sites for purple martins because they're nesting in these small diameter snags in advanced stages of decay, but they're also rapidly colonizing artificial housing units that were placed in these upland forest sites. So those two things together lead us to believe that they are limited in their nesting structures, and that's why they're using these small, puny little snags. Okay, so the last part of the habitat piece of my master's work was developing a habitat suitability model. So as we see here, I actually used the data that I collected on purple martin nest sites to extrapolate in a predictive manner to all of Western Oregon. So the scale on this is that it's the hotter colors, the red is a higher probability of occupancy by purple martins, and the cooler blue colors is a very low probability of occupancy. So you can see these red areas on this, this habitat suitability map are we would expect to be more likely to see purple martins nesting there than in the blue areas. So my first stab at a purple martin habitat suitability model got a B- in terms of its ability to predict where purple martins are actually nesting, and that's okay. That's actually pretty good because we weren't able to input snag data into this model, which is hugely important. There is not contiguous snag data for the state of Oregon, and therefore we were missing a major component of purple martin habitat just based on the lack of data available. So for example, if you see this big clear cut, there's no snags anywhere, but it is this early seral open habitat that would come up as a dark red high probability of occupancy by purple martins in that model. But there's no snags, so there's not going to be purple martins there. So this is type 1 error. If there were a big snag here, there'd probably be nesting purple martins, to be honest with you, but my model was not able to capture that. So that's where that error came from. So we learned that snags might be a major limiting factor in populations of western purple martins that are still nesting in cavities and natural snags. Are they taking whatever snag cavities they can get, you know, in those little puny, small diameter snags? And does that mean that other snag nesting bird species are also limited by snag availability? There are lots of other bird species. I have a picture of a red-breasted sapsucker and a violet-green swallow here. Lots of other snag nesting species that might be impacted as well. One thing I noticed while I was out surveying birds and banding birds is that they're nesting in these 3 different ecotypes: upland forest early seral habitat, like we've talked about, inland open water sites like big lakes and reservoirs, and coastal tidally influenced wetlands, estuaries, and river mouths. We observed that birds were moving between these 3 ecotypes. So the inland open water and coastal sites are primarily nest box colonies, and the upland forest colonies are primarily snag nesting colonies. We hypothesized that the open water ecotype was serving as a source population where hatchier birds would disperse into upland forest. There's big colonies of birds in these lakes and open water reservoirs. This launched these two questions. Can birds born in artificial housing units nest in natural cavities in snags as adults? And then, are birds from large open water colonies able to disperse to colonize these upland forest snag cavity sites? To answer these questions, we utilize the color banding program that is ongoing with Western purple martin nestlings. We are focusing on purple martin nestlings in nest boxes because they're easier to get to, but we have banded some nesting in snag cavities just in small numbers. These birds are banded with a band on each leg. On one leg is a silver federal band, on the other leg is a color band with an alphanumeric code that is unique to that individual bird. In Oregon, we use red color bands. Washington, green. British Columbia, I believe, it's either blue or gold. So these banding numbers are outdated. We've definitely banded more than 1,000 birds since 2019. I just haven't been involved in the banding anymore since 2019. Definitely more than 200 birds in the Coos Bay BLM district since 2019. I started reciting banded birds in 2016 as a pilot project and continued doing that for several years after with funding from the Purple Martin Conservation Association. I realized since we are not all from Oregon, these location names are less important than the actual movement between them. So here we have Fern Ridge Reservoir, which is a big reservoir, a big open body of water. And there is a very large population of nesting purple martins there. They are all, or mostly all, in nest boxes, so artificial housing units. And at the research forest, there are both snag nesters and artificial housing unit nesters. I noticed several birds moving between these two, the upland forest, research forest, and the Fern Ridge Reservoir open water, Ecotypes, but they were moving from artificial housing unit to artificial housing unit. I also noticed a bird that was born in a nest box at Fern Ridge Reservoir and moved to a nest box at Coos Bay. So again, artificial housing unit to artificial housing unit, but between two different ecotypes, between that open water reservoir habitat and that coastal tidally influenced habitat. So already we've answered that first question, do the birds move between ecotypes? And they do. This one was just the farthest distance that we had seen a bird move at the time. This green banded bird came from Washington to nest in a nest box down in our Oregon State University research forest. So just kind of a fun find to see the green band on the leg instead of our typical red band for Oregon. In 2017, we are also seeing the same kind of a highway of movement between the Oregon State Research Forest nest boxes and gourds and the Fern Ridge Reservoir nest boxes and gourds. But we started looking at other lakes and reservoirs too, and we noticed birds were moving between those as well. So there's lots of birds moving from reservoir to reservoir, between that open water ecotype. There's also still those birds moving between upland forest and reservoir. We had that bird move from upland or open water to the coastal habitat, and we have another long distance bird here moving from Washington to Oregon, just kind of a far distance travel. But the really exciting part here is that we saw birds moving from nest boxes and gourds into natural snag cavities in the upland forest. So this was the first bird that we found proving that, and it was quite an exciting find to see this bird in a natural snag cavity. That then answered both of our questions. Yes, these birds move between ecosystems, and yes, they move between nesting substrates. Just to reiterate how exciting these finds were, yes, birds born in artificial housing can nest in natural cavities and snags as adults. And yes, birds from open water colonies disperse to colonize upland forest sites. And the third yes being they do move between ecotypes. So that is all that I have for you today. I would like to say thanks for listening to my talk. Thank you to the Purple Martin Conservation Association for helping fund this work. Thank you to Joan Hagar for being my advisor. And thanks to all these other folks for letting us on their land and helping out with this project. And with that, I will open it up to questions.
Thank you, Lorelle, or I'll tell you thank you when I talk to you later. Um, Joan, thank you for being here to field questions if there are any. Um, just really exciting to see that capability of the martins to go from artificial cavities back into the natural cavities that historically they would have been using. So it's just an important question answered there. Um, all right. Madeline asks in chat, are the other snag nesting species using cavities at the same time as purple martins, or could more than one bird use the same cavity at different times in the same season? That's actually really interesting.
Yes and yes. So we've seen, in my talk, I showed that slide with the purple martin and the red-breasted sapsucker both trying to occupy the same cavity at the same time. And we also see, well, most of the natural cavities that purple martins are using here are formed by flickers in the first place. And so flickers use them, and then the purple martins use them. We also, in the very large snags, I call them apartment snags, because you can have a couple of species, sometimes 3 species nesting at once. So we've had snags with 1 or 2 purple martin cavities going, and tree swallow or violet green swallow nesting at the same time, and maybe a woodpecker. So when the snags are really big and have lots of cavities, you can have multiple species.
Thank you. A couple of quick ones here and then we'll break. I'm sorry that we're running late here, guys. When they say boxes, are they literal wood boxes with a hole?
Yeah, at Fern Ridge on those, that's the site where the snags were dropped by helicopter and stuck in the mud of the reservoir. Those have wooden boxes with the hole. And yep, that's it.
Okay, and then finally, Dan asks, can you give us movement distances among sites? So about how far apart were some of those sites?
Well, from the Columbia River site to Fern Ridge site is on the order of 200 miles. I believe that was a bird that came for the fall roost. So it had been banded up there on the Columbia Gorge, and then in the fall it came and swarmed with all the other martins at the Fern Ridge roost.
Got it. All right. Thank you so much, Joan, for sticking around to answer questions. I appreciate it so much.